that homework. Let's add a second field to the form. So the crew this morning wanted the second field to be which Chris, as opposed to like the year or your rating of the movie or whatever. So we'll stick with that. So let's add a new field to the form. All I mean by that is add another input, right? So let's throw another input in here. Equals text, sure. Name, Chris name. I'll go ahead and put some line breaks in here so it'll fit on the screen a little better. Put a placeholder in there. Which Chris. I will not put autofocus because that would steal it from the first one. All right, beautiful. Which Chris probably doesn't need to be as big as the flick name. So I could make that, I could add a rule for that. And as it turns out, I just copied and pasted in a rule that I wrote for that. So what I did was I added a rule for an input of type text that has a class of smaller, and I made it use up less of that extra space that's left over. So I just wrote a rule for something that has a class of smaller on it. So I will just throw class equals smaller on this second field, and it won't take up as much space. Groovy, so now we have two fields on our form, so we should make it actually show up on the page, right? So how can we do that? We gave it a name of Chris name. So I'm not adding a whole new form. I'm not adding a whole new event listener or any of that. I'm just adding a second field in the form, and then I need to do something with it. So we're still handling the same event here. Speaking of which, update heading is not what this does, right? And the first part of your homework was to rename this. So I am going to actually rename this handle submit. Our function should really only have one job. And the job of this function is to handle the submission of the form. Right now it's doing too darn much, frankly. You could name it something like add flick or something. That's fine. I'm not doing that because I think I want a different function to be named add flick down the road. I want handle submit to be responsible for sending out these other messages to get the actual work done. All I really want handle submit to do is manage the form. So as I step in that direction, I'm just going to name it handle submit. You'll see I often name my event handlers this way. But at least it's not change heading anymore because it didn't even do that. All right. So we got flick name out of the form like this. So we ought to be able to get Chris name out of the form like that. Const Chris name equals f dot Chris name dot value, right? Well, here, let's do it like this. Because both of those go in there, right? So the text content, I could have it add both the flick name and the Chris name. I could use my new template literal trick. Flick name starring Chris name. I think he used to be the governor of New Jersey. Oh, topical. All right. Yeah. Enter a flick. Captain America, the First Avenger, Catfa. That was Evans. There you go. Catfa, starring Chris Evans. Pretty fancy. Go us, right? Very nice, very nice.
What's the name of that you just did?
Oh, what's the name of what?
When you put the dollar sign in
Oh, that's so this whole thing using backticks instead of quotes, that's a template literal instead of a string literal. And this trick with the dollar sign curly braces is called string interpolation, when you can actually put a JavaScript expression in the middle of a string. Yeah.
So you're using the same text content line
Right.
to print out. Wait, is that the word you use for JavaScript print?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Print out both the values in the same line.
Sure. Yep.
And to do that, you have to use like the whole dollar.
You wouldn't have to do that. You know, the other way would be by using string concatenation. So I could say flick name plus the string comma space starring Chris space plus Chris name, like that, right? So I could do it by adding strings together, right? So this is just an easier way to do that. Because that frankly is pretty hard to read, I think. So that's the other way you could do that. Make sure I didn't mess that up. The one with the boat and the Boston accents, starring Chris Pine. All right. Cool. Totally works. Now in our homework, we wanted to add them as separate elements so that we could target them with CSS and stuff, right? So, no problem. What I said here in the homework description was maybe do something like this. Inside the li, make a couple of spans. So that's 2 new elements we need to create, right? So we should see document.createElement 2 more times. You dig? So let's do that once for each of these. So for flick name, let's make a flick span. Why not? Const. Flick span equals document.createElement. What kind of element? Span. And then we'll set the text content of that one. Flick span dot text content equals flick name. And we'll do the same thing with Chris name down here. So const Chris span equals document dot create element span. And I'll say Chris span dot text content equals Chris name. And then instead of setting the text content on the item, I'll just append a couple children to it, right? I want these spans inside that li. So I've created an li. Now I append to it. So item.append child. Flick span. Item.append child. Chris span. Does it work? Let's see. Gifted, starring Chris Evans. About the little girl who's good at math and stuff. Gifted Evans, all right. Now they're all smashed together now, right? But we have them in separate spans. Let's look at the HTML here. Or it's not really HTML, this is the DOM. Yeah, they're in separate spans. So if we wanted to style them differently so they were on separate lines or something, we could do that. But we need some new tricks to do that. So at least now we have a second field. We'll worry about styling it here in a second. So add a form field for Chris name. Don't forget to push.